Hope had not realized how deeply she craved stillness until the idea of escape began to take shape. In her mind, for so long, her life had been lived in fragments, interrupted by crises, expectations, and the constant presence of other people's opinions pressing in on every decision she made. Love, even when sincere, had always been tested by noise. It was this exhaustion, more than any sudden impulse, that led her to propose something different to Liam. A honeymoon far from familiar roads, far from recognizable faces, tucked into a remote mountain resort where the world could not intrude. In her imagination, the place existed as a blank page, a beginning untouched by past disappointments. She believed that distance could cleanse what proximity had strained, that solitude could restore what scrutiny had eroded. To Hope, the journey itself symbolized intention, a conscious step toward choosing each other again, not out of habit or history, but out of desire. Liam responded to her proposal with an ease that surprised even him. The idea of leaving everything behind, even temporarily, felt liberating. He had grown accustomed to living under emotional tension, constantly pulled between responsibility and longing, expectation and doubt. Hope's suggestion did not feel like an escape from reality so much as an invitation to redefine it. He saw in her eyes a quiet determination, a belief that love could still be rebuilt if given the right conditions. Accepting the plan was not merely an act of agreement but an act of faith. He allowed himself to imagine mornings without urgency, conversations without interruption, and moments where their connection did not have to compete with the weight of the past. In agreeing to the trip, Liam embraced the possibility that happiness did not have to be earned through struggle, that it could simply exist if they were brave enough to claim it. As they prepared for the journey, anticipation wrapped itself around them like a promise. Each shared glance carried the unspoken hope that this trip would mark a turning point, a chance to solidify what had too often felt fragile. They packed lightly, deliberately leaving behind symbols of routine, as though shedding physical weight could also free them emotionally. When they finally set out, the city receded behind them, its familiar chaos dissolving into distance. The road stretched ahead, winding upward into terrain that felt untouched and quietly imposing. Mountains rose like sentinels, ancient and indifferent, as if reminding them that human worries were fleeting in the face of something far larger. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper, and the sense of being alone together intensified with every mile. The drive itself unfolded like a dream, the landscape transforming gradually yet profoundly. Trees crowded closer to the road, their shadows shifting with the movement of the sun. The farther they traveled, the more the world seemed to narrow to the rhythm of tires against asphalt and the steady hum of the engine. Romance lingered in the quiet between them, not in grand gestures but in the simple awareness of shared presence. Hope rested in the comfort of this closeness, believing that nothing could intrude upon the fragile peace they had found. Liam, too, allowed himself to relax, trusting the road and the moment, convinced that the hardest parts of their story were behind them. Yet nature, indifferent to intention, has its own language, and it spoke without warning. The road, slick from an earlier, unseen storm or perhaps marred by debris fallen from the heights above, betrayed them in an instant. The loss of control was sudden, violent in its abruptness. One moment, the car moved forward with purpose, the next, it responded to nothing at all. Time fractured into disjointed sensations, the jolt of momentum shifting, the sharp awareness of gravity asserting itself, the realization that the familiar rules no longer applied. The mountains that had seemed so serene moments earlier now loomed as silent witnesses to disaster. The vehicle left the road with terrifying speed, the sound of metal protesting against inevitability cutting through the air. As it plunged toward the ravine, the world seemed to collapse inward, compressing fear, confusion, and disbelief into a single breathless moment. The fall was not graceful, it was chaotic, brutal, and unforgiving. Impact followed impact, each collision erasing another fragment of certainty. The final crash shattered the stillness of the mountains with a thunderous force, echoing across the empty expanse before silence reclaimed its dominance. What remained in the aftermath was devastation suspended in quiet. The wreckage lay twisted and broken, a violent interruption in an otherwise untouched landscape. The car, once a vessel of hope and anticipation, had become an unrecognizable mass of metal, half hidden among rocks and trees. There were no voices, no movement, only the unsettling calm that follows catastrophe. The mountains stood unchanged, indifferent to the human tragedy unfolding at their base. The road above continued its winding path, unaware that it had just claimed something irreplaceable. Hope and Liam's fate dissolved into uncertainty, swallowed by distance and silence. No one witnessed the fall. No immediate rescue followed. The absence of answers hung heavily, more frightening than confirmation ever could be. In that stillness, possibility fractured into countless questions. Were they alive, clinging to consciousness amid the wreckage? Had the mountains claimed them entirely, rendering their hopes and plans abruptly meaningless? The lack of clarity transformed the accident from an event into a mystery, one that refused resolution. The tragedy of the moment lay not only in the violence of the crash but in its timing. Love, newly reaffirmed, had been interrupted at the precise moment it dared to believe in permanence. The honeymoon that was meant to symbolize renewal instead became a boundary between what had been and what might never be. Hope's vision of a new chapter, carefully imagined and tenderly offered, now existed only as a haunting contrast to the wreckage below the cliff. Liam's acceptance of that future, rooted in trust and optimism, felt painfully fragile in hindsight, as though faith itself had been tested and found wanting. In the broader silence, the accident became something more than a singular tragedy. It embodied the cruel unpredictability that shadows even the most deliberate choices. Neither Hope nor Liam had been reckless. They had not chased danger or defied reason. They had simply believed that love, when nurtured, could endure. The mountains offered no commentary, no moral judgment, only the reminder that human intention does not govern fate. The world continued, indifferent, while uncertainty settled like a fog over everything they had left behind. What lingered most powerfully was the unanswered question of survival. In the absence of certainty, imagination filled the void, conjuring images both hopeful and devastating. Perhaps Hope clung to life, sustained by the same resilience that had carried her through emotional storms before. Perhaps Liam, driven by instinct and devotion, fought against pain and darkness to protect the woman he loved. Or perhaps the silence was final, the stillness absolute. Without witnesses or confirmation, their story suspended itself between tragedy and miracle. The road to the resort remained empty, untouched by the promise that had once animated it. The mountains, ancient and unmoved, reclaimed their quiet dominance. And somewhere between the sky above and the ravine below, the future Hope and Liam had envisioned dissolved into uncertainty, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been. Their fate, unresolved and haunting, became a reminder that even the most carefully chosen paths can end abruptly. And that love, no matter how sincere, exists always at the mercy of forces beyond its control. The news did not arrive gently. It tore through the fragile calm of the day with a violence that words alone could not contain. The accident involving Hope and Liam spread with terrifying speed, reaching Brooke and Katie not as a rumor or speculation, but as a blunt, irreversible reality. In a single moment, everything else, every argument, every carefully constructed grievance, every lingering resentment tied to the name Logan, collapsed into insignificance. The weight of the news did not allow for gradual understanding. It struck all at once, leaving shock in its wake, the kind that numbs the body before the mind can catch up. Brooke felt at first as disbelief, a refusal to accept that something so catastrophic could happen without warning. Hope, her daughter, had been alive and dreaming of a future only hours earlier. Now, that future hung suspended in uncertainty, and the terror of that uncertainty eclipsed every other concern. Katie's reaction mirrored Brooke's in intensity, though it took a different shape. Where Brooke's shock threatened to unravel her completely, Katie's manifested as a chilling stillness. She had spent so long navigating emotional battlefields, defending boundaries, and standing her ground in conflicts that seemed all-consuming at the time. Yet faced with the possibility of losing hope, all of that resolve felt hollow. The arguments over legacy, over the meaning and ownership of the Logan name, suddenly appeared cruelly trivial. Katie understood, with painful clarity, how easily time could erase the illusion of control. The thought that Hope's life might be slipping away while they had been consumed by pride and rivalry filled her with a quiet, corrosive guilt. There was no discussion, no hesitation. Brooke and Katie moved as if guided by instinct rather than thought, driven by a singular purpose that drowned out everything else. Bill and Ridge followed, their own conflicts silenced by the gravity of the moment. Whatever divisions had existed between them dissolved in the face of shared fear. Bill, so often defined by power and dominance, found himself stripped of both. The news reduced him to something raw and human, a man confronting the terrifying limits of influence. Money, reputation, and authority offered no protection here. All he could do was go, driven by a desperate need to be present, as though proximity alone might alter fate. Ridge, too, felt the collapse of perspective with brutal force. His life had long been defined by divided loyalties, by choices that reverberated through families and generations. Yet standing on the edge of this crisis, those divisions no longer mattered. Hope was not a symbol, not a point of contention, not part of a larger narrative of rivalry. She was simply a young woman whose life hung in the balance. The realization cut through Ridge with a sharpness that left no room for defensiveness. Fear has a way of clarifying what truly matters. And in that clarity, Ridge recognized how fragile everything was. The journey to the hospital felt endless, each mile stretching time into something unbearable. Silence dominated the car, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the unspoken fear each of them carried. Brooke's thoughts spiraled relentlessly, replaying memories of hope as a child, as a young woman, as someone who had fought so hard to build a life defined by compassion and integrity. The idea that all of that could be erased in an instant felt obscene. Katie struggled with a similar flood of memories, each one sharpening the dread that they might arrive too late. Bill stared ahead, his jaw clenched, his mind grasping for certainty where none existed. Ridge, usually so ready to speak, found himself unable to form words that would not shatter under their own emptiness. When they reached the hospital, the sterile brightness of the corridors offered no comfort. The space felt cold, indifferent, a place where hope and despair coexisted in uneasy silence. The waiting area became a crucible, stripping away pretense and forcing raw emotion to the surface. Brooke's composure fractured under the strain, her fear no longer containable. Katie stood beside her, offering support not through words but through presence, understanding that nothing she could say would ease the agony of not knowing. In that moment, the bond between the sisters reasserted itself, not as a narrative convenience but as an emotional necessity. Whatever had divided them before now seemed small, even shameful, against the enormity of what they faced. Bill and Ridge hovered close, their own anxieties visible despite years of emotional armor. The rivalry that had so often defined their interactions fell away, replaced by a shared helplessness that neither could deny. They were no longer opponents or symbols of competing legacies. They were simply men waiting to learn whether a young woman they loved would survive. The hospital, with its muted sounds and relentless ticking of time, forced them into stillness, into a confrontation with vulnerability they could not escape. As the hours dragged on, the reality of the situation settled heavily over all of them. The accident did not just threaten Hope's life. It threatened the fragile structure of relationships that had been strained for so long. Brooke became acutely aware of how much energy she had spent fighting battles that now felt meaningless. The name Logan, once a source of pride and conflict, faded into the background. What mattered was flesh and blood, breath and heartbeat. Katie felt the same reckoning unfold within her. She recognized how easily people mistake conflict for purpose. How quickly they forget what truly binds them together until loss looms close enough to touch. This crisis forced an unspoken truce among them. No one declared it, no one needed to. The urgency of Hope's condition erased the need for negotiation. In the face of possible tragedy, unity was not a choice but a reflex. Brooke and Katie leaned on each other without reservation, their shared fear overriding years of tension. Bill and Ridge, standing side by side, found that rivalry had no place here. The storylines that had once driven their actions paused, suspended by the weight of a single, terrifying question. Would Hope live? The waiting became its own form of torment. Each passing moment deepened the sense of powerlessness. Brooke's thoughts turned inward, questioning every decision she had made, every moment she had taken for granted. Katie wrestled with regret, wishing she had chosen empathy over pride sooner. Bill confronted the limits of control, realizing that even his greatest strengths meant nothing here. Ridge faced the uncomfortable truth that time does not wait for resolution. That reconciliation often comes too late. In this suspended state, the Logan family's long-running conflicts lost their narrative momentum. The urgency that had once fueled them evaporated, replaced by something far more elemental. Survival eclipsed symbolism. Love overshadowed legacy. The hospital became a space where old wounds were not healed but temporarily forgotten, set aside in the presence of something far more immediate and unforgiving. What bound them together in that moment was not hope alone, but fear, shared, unfiltered, and undeniable. It stripped them of defensiveness and forced them to acknowledge their dependence on one another. Brooke and Katie rediscovered the strength of their sisterhood not through reconciliation, but through shared anguish. Bill and Ridge found themselves aligned not by agreement but by desperation. The crisis did not resolve their differences, it rendered them irrelevant. As they waited for news, the silence spoke louder than any argument ever had. It reminded them that life does not pause for pride, that tragedy does not discriminate based on past grievances. The accident involving Hope and Liam became a brutal equalizer, compelling unity where division had thrived. In the shadow of that uncertainty, the Logan storyline shifted, its conflicts temporarily suspended by the gravity of potential loss. Whether Hope would survive remained unknown, and that uncertainty was the cruelest element of all. Yet even in that darkness, something profound emerged. The family, fractured and strained, stood together not because they had resolved their issues, but because they understood, perhaps for the first time in a long while, what truly mattered. The arguments over names, legacies, and pride faded into silence, replaced by a collective reckoning with mortality and love. In that hospital, beneath the harsh lights and ticking clocks, the Logan family found themselves united by fear, bound by love, and reminded that some moments demand everything else be set aside.